Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Once a DJ. If you'd like to support the show, then head to onceadj.com/support to find out how you can help. If you'd like to get in touch with any feedback or suggestions, email onceadjpodcast@gmail.com. Once a DJ is produced by the good people at Remote Control. If you'd like to find out more about working with them, head to remote-ctrl.co.uk. Time for the show. Once a DJ is brought to you with the support of Vinyl Underground Record Store. Since 1993, VU has been shipping new and used underground house, techno, disco, hip-hop, soul and more worldwide from Northampton in the UK. They're your go-to store for upfront releases, repressed classics and deep digging for undiscovered gems. And they're a great crew to deal with who really care about the music and their customers. To show the support to the Once a DJ community, they're giving you 10% off your next order. Just head to vinylunderground.co.uk and use the code ONCEADJ10 at checkout. You also get free UK delivery on all orders over £100. That's ONCEADJ10 at vinylunderground.co.uk. Welcome to Once a DJ, founder of the legendary Wax Poetics and SVP of Global Catalogue Development and Marketing at Warner Music Group, Mr. Andre Torres.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it, Adam. I actually am now the former SVP of Global Catalog Development and Marketing at Warner. But yeah, it was a good ride. I had a couple of years there. Thank you.
Oh, amazing. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. You know, it's a little early here in LA, but yeah, I'm ready to start my day off with a proper conversation here. So yeah, I can't complain. How's things over there?
Yeah, good. I mean, we've had a bad summer weather-wise, but beyond that, I've had a little bit of something blow my mind today. So I've been asking on Instagram about how people best deal with wide spindle holes on records, because I've always just done the kind of the shiny stuff from like tape stickers, and someone's just said super glue. So that's kind of blown my mind. Like, super glue, it sounds incredible, because if you do that and it's too thick, then you can just file it back down, can't you?
Yes. No, that's a new one from me too, bro. I'm impressed. Whoever came up with that one, that's pretty good.
I'll get some more info and share it.
Yeah, please, man. That's good. Okay. Super glue.
So bearing in mind all the things that we've got to kind of chat about today, it'd be great to just really start off with how you got into music and records, really, and your background and where you're from, things like that.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so I was born in New York, in the Bronx, actually. I was 3 when we moved, so I have some recollection of those early years, but, you know, I used to come back every summer to visit my grandparents in Queens until I was probably about 10 or 11. You know, I did some research after talking with my father about where we lived, and, you know, it turned out it was like a 5-minute walk from Sedgwick Avenue, from where hip-hop started. He actually owned a record store in the Bronx called The Stump. It was actually he tells me the story, it was a pet store that he turned the other half of the store into a record store. So I think this probably, you know, would have been one of the first multi-use record / pet stores, which he then had a couple of Black Spades, who were the big gang up there. There was some construction going on, and there was a huge tree stump that they had dug up. So he asked these kids who were in the gang to come pick the stump up and bring it over to the record store. Hence the name, The Stump, of the record store. But once the stump was in the window, my grandmother used to sell jewelry, gold jewelry that she got from the Italians. My grandmother's Puerto Rican and Cuban. He hung the jewelry on the stump. So it then became a record store / pet store / jewelry store. And, he pretty much introduced me to everything I know about music. I mean, again, he was, there in the 60s to see Hendrix at Cafe Wah in the Village. Before he left to go to the UK, would tell me stories about going to parties as a kid in Harlem, teenagers. Like, I'd have my Miles Davis records, and, they were really big on the newest sounds. And so I think that really kind of became part of me. When my grandparents moved to Florida, my grandfather brought his record collection with him. So, he was, right there in Spanish Harlem, with Tito Puente, and all these guys were like his contemporaries. So he was running around with these guys and hearing the music firsthand. And my father grew up in that home. So music was always big. Unfortunately, even though my father owned a record store, when we all moved to Florida, I was 3. So I didn't realize the crime that had occurred until much later in life when I started collecting records. And he was telling me, I remember I used to own a record store and everything. I remember having all these records around when I was young in New York, but we didn't have any in Florida. And I'm like, what did you do with all those records in New York? You go, oh, man, it was too much. Man, I had to just leave them. And I was just like, oh, God, because, it's 1972, like I can only imagine what that collection had in it. So I think part of my desire for collecting came out of A, listening to hip hop, but B, knowing I had some of those records near me and never was able to listen to them. But he started going to thrift stores when we were in Florida, buying up a lot of these records that he had left in New York. So when I would come back home, like from college for Christmas or whatever, I would just go in hard and be pulling out, Les McCann layers. And at that point, I'm like in thrift stores every day. I'm not even really buying records out of too many record stores. I'm still really mostly thrift shopping. But, back then you could find great records for 10 cents at Salvation Army. So I think it was just really there around me. And, I always enjoyed music, as a kid. I was always listening to all kinds of different stuff. Again, my grandfather was huge Latin jazz. My father definitely like more funk, soul, rock. He introduced me to like Led Zeppelin and a lot of like the, classic rock stuff too. So yeah, it was just something that was really in my DNA and was always around pretty much.
Yeah. So what sort of age would you have started doing that collecting? Like when did you get that bug?
Yeah, I was a little late to it. I mean, I wasn't even really digging in high school. I know kids who were like, like Quest is like buying records when he was like 8 years old. And I was like on the Columbia, get 8 albums for a penny. So, I did have records as a kid, but I wouldn't have considered myself like a proper collector. So it wasn't really until I got to college that I think I started to kind of like piece it all together. Because I remember freshman year riding around with my man in his car, and we were listening to like the new De La record, and I think the PE album had just come out too. So like these were like super impactful, chock full of samples, and we were just riding around listening, and I'm like, oh wait, I recognize that. So I think it was around then that I started to kind of piece it all together. Cause I grew up in Florida. So, I think it would have been a completely different experience had we stayed in New York, but my father moved us out when I was a kid. So I kind of was like detached. I'd come back, but then again, my grandparents moved when I was probably 10 or 11. So my early teenage years, whatever hip hop I was getting, was coming on from tapes from New York, people I knew either that I worked with or family members, who would just kind of like dub. I might have had a 6th-generation cassette of some radio show, most of which I can't even remember who. So yeah, I think that was, I would even dare say, I got freshman year in college, I got suspended, had to go home for a semester, and then I came back. And that's when I think the collecting really started to kick in. So yeah, probably like 2nd, 3rd year of college.
Okay. Can I ask what you got suspended for?
Well, it was 1988, and you probably heard all the kids are talking about it now. Molly had just become illegal in the U.S. It was legally sold in bars like in the mid 80s and stuff. So turns out we were in college. Everybody wanted it. And we knew a girl who knew Bob Dylan's son, it turns out, was the connect. And so we were getting all this ecstasy in powder form. This was 1988, before anybody was messing with the formula. So, and it was, pre-rave era. So we would take Molly on a Tuesday and just ride bikes around and sit on the roof and look at the trees and feel the breeze. And, we were there as it became like, oh, wait, let's take this on Saturday and go out. And, then it was like, became like the weekend kind of thing. But yeah, we had a shipment coming. It never came. And then it turned out the campus police had been tapping our phones and watching our activity. And they came and swooped down on us one morning. Wow. So yeah, it was young boy hijinks. I don't think I quite understood the gravity of it all. We were just some Molly. But yeah, clearly illegal. And so they gave me some sort of 6 months like pre-trial intervention. And I never had to do any real jail time. And they kind of expunged it off my record after that. But yeah, it definitely was something I had to kind of like make some decisions about how I was going to spend my time more constructively. So,
did you buy with the intent to supply and profit?
Oh yeah, most definitely. I mean, we were getting regular shipments prior to that one big one coming. I mean, not like kilos of Molly, but definitely like 8 balls and half-quarter ounces of, pure powdered ecstasy.
Yeah.
That stuff goes a long way too. So,
but I mean, like one of the first things that's mentioned on your Wikipedia is the word entrepreneur. And I think there's a lot of crossover with a bit of drug dealing and a bit of entrepreneurship, because you learn loads about, supply chains and dealing with customers, profit margins.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I didn't get into the details about why we left New York, but that was because the RICO laws were just coming into effect, which are the racketeering. And so my father tells me the story of how these officers, agents, were coming by the house looking for him because he was also an entrepreneur. Again, used to own a record store, and so I guess he had been in the streets and prides himself on being like a New Yorican, half Puerto Rican, half black, like hustler in the streets of New York. He never had a job. He just hustled. And so drugs clearly became part of that equation. And, I guess he got pretty big enough. He's like, I was more of a connector kind of guy, but I did pretty well for myself. Well enough so that he said one day he's walking down the street in New York and he sees these guys walking towards him and they go, "Are you Benny Torres?" It's my father's name. And he just ignored them. Like, I don't know who these guys are. And they stopped him and were like, hey, we know who you are and we know what you've been doing. And it's only a matter of time because clearly the RICO laws were in effect and they were trying to get everybody. And that was literally when he was like, yo, we got to get the fuck out of New York. And so he tells me the story. He's like, if I had a nickel for every dollar that somebody owed me, we'd be rich right now. But he literally just came back, told my mother, pack up, we're going to leave. And that's how we moved to Florida. So it was a little bit of a, you know, we had to leave town in a little bit of a hurry. And yeah, that was, you know, my father was here last month for my kid's graduation and was telling me more stories. It's great now because he overshares things with me about back then. And, you know, he told me wasn't until I got to Florida that I actually learned hard work because it had been hustles pretty much his entire life up until that point. And then now he finally was in a new state with a family and he had to kind of figure it out. So no more drug sales.
It must have been, of all the places to move to not get into the drug industry,
yeah,
Florida's a kind of funny one.
Exactly. Especially because it was the business of cocaine, clearly, especially. So, yeah, and it all comes back full circle much later in life. My father, he's actually trying to set his own podcast up, but this guy has more stories than anyone I've ever met. And I've told him, bro, you gotta I've been trying to even record some of them because, yeah, he, exactly what you just said. Florida became pretty well known for its, you know, cocaine. And at some point when I was in private school and the tuition became a bit of an issue, my father tells me he jumped back in the game and got me through private school.
Yeah.
Back on his old ways. So, yeah, you know, the entrepreneurial hustler spirit, I definitely think is something that, yeah, I was kind of like around to sort of see with my father. You know, he never was like the guy who had like a job for 20 years and got the gold watch when he retired. He was always like moving in and out of different positions and different industries and just always trying to level up. You know, we were always like moving into a better neighborhood. And, you know, again, he brought us to Florida and put us, you know, my sister and I in private school. I went to private school pretty much my whole life, from Jesuit high school and a Catholic elementary school. So that was super important to him. And it was like he was going to make it happen however. So I definitely admire the guy for that. And I've tried to kind of emulate some of those traits as a father myself. So, yeah.
So what did you study at college?
I actually got my degree in painting. Yeah, fine arts. You know, I started out engineering, actually. And then that first semester of engineering calculus was like, oh, shit, I guess you really have to want this. And I realized at that point, you know, I was kind of still trapped in like Jesuit high school brain of like, got to get a good job. And I wasn't even thinking creatively at that point. And once I got to college and I transferred out of engineering and came back wanting to do architecture. So I was like, at least I could be creative, but it does have some sort of engineering aspect to it. And, but at the same time, I took one art class, ceramics, and that was it, man. I just was like, no, I want to make shit like with my hands, and I don't want to have to deal with like, you know, construction crews and creating models of buildings that may not ever get made. And so, I just stayed in there with the ceramics guys who were mad cool. They'd be in there late smoking weed, spinning pots, and I'd be hanging with them like, damn, yo, this shit's ill. Yeah, so I eventually said, you know what, I'm gonna get a fine arts degree, and then my concentration being painting. So I got out and thought I was gonna go to grad school and get masters and go teach. All my teachers, oh, you should go and you can go teach at Yale or some great school and yada yada yada. So that was really with the intention.
Was that because of your ability in art, or was it because of your communication skills that they suggested teaching at that level?
Yeah, definitely my abilities in art. I had been winning like a bunch of awards in college, and I was the only black dude probably in the art program, at least within this smaller painting realm. And I had a couple homies, but yeah, I was pretty dead set on it. And I used to do a lot of like very black identity politics stuff. And, but the problem was, I'm looking at some of these other black artists. I go to, I get to New York, I go to these shows, and like, there's these amazing black artists making work, and me and him, the only two brothers in the damn museum, in the gallery. I'm like, well, this is some great stuff, but where are we? We need to be in here looking at making all this great stuff for us, but a bunch of white people here. And he's like, oh, that's a great point, bro. We need to talk more about that. And so, I think that was where I started to get a little disillusioned with like the art world and, a career in art. And, I think music eventually just sort of eclipsed my interest or passion.
Once a DJ is brought to you with the support of Vinyl Underground Record Store. Since 1993, VU has been shipping new and used underground house, techno, disco, hip-hop, soul and more worldwide from Northampton in the UK. They're your go-to store for upfront releases, repressed classics and deep digging for undiscovered gems. And they're a great crew to deal with who really care about the music and their customers. To show the support to the Once a DJ community, they're giving you 10% off your next order. Just head to vinylunderground.co.uk and use the code ONCEADJ10 at checkout. You also get free UK delivery on all orders over £100. That's ONCEADJ10 at vinylunderground.co.uk. I wanted to create a product for the listeners to be able to support the show and for the guests as a token of gratitude for being on, so I've teamed up with Sure Shot Shop to create some Once a DJ 45 RPM adapter clamps. These are my weapon of choice as a 45 adapter, as they add stability and grip to aid you in any setup. These are available for £25 each plus flat fee postage from onceadj.bigcartel.com. And if you'd like to see the other models you can buy and also customise, check out sureshotshop.com. Just on a side note on that, someone I know is programming or has been programming DJs at the Tate Modern in London.
Oh, yeah.
And they're hammering that they need diversity within the DJs, but then the clientele pretty much that can afford to go there and drink when a beer costs you £8, it's pretty much just kind of like rich middle-aged white people from Surrey. And I don't think they kind of realise the irony of that.
Yeah, right.
It's a really funny one.
Yeah. No, I've seen that.
After college then, what was it that you went on to do? Because it was quite a long time until Wax Poetics, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I came to New York in 95, looking to go to grad school. I started working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, thinking eventually I was going to go to grad school. I had been kind of looking at Pratt, and, I'm working in a museum with a bunch of other artists, pretty much all of them. I started out like at visitor services and moved into being a security guard, which is what all the kind of cool art dudes were. And you just stand there and have to do anything. It looked easy, but then I thought, fuck, I got to do this for 12 hours today. Like, and it was like, brutal schedule, 2 12-hour days on Friday and Saturday. And then you'd have to do 8 hours on Sunday. So it was like you would be, at 30 hours just on 3 days. And so the schedule was crazy, but we used to just go out and party after. Sometimes just stay out all night and come back into work the next day to do another 12 hours. So yeah, I pretty much did that as long as I could until, this union was like, sorry, bro, we can't help you anymore. You got too many infractions. And, because you'd be standing against a wall and they'd be like, Torres, they'd write you up, it's union and all this. I was like, bro, listen. And then I'm looking at these guys I'm working with. I'm like just out of college, maybe a couple years. And I had some trouble in college, as you know. So my schedule was a little behind, but I'm looking at these guys, man. They've been working as a guard at the museum for 8 years, like 10 years after college. Like, bro, I'm not trying to live here and be a guard forever. Like, so I was like, whatever, bro. I don't even really care. So, I was just out trying to figure out kind of what I was going to do, and wound up working at like this sign place where we would go and install these big things on windows and wrap these buses and advertisements. And, I thought at least I can kind of just do this and chill. I was like just collecting records. My man had a sampler, so I would take a bunch of records up to his crib. And, we knew a guy, Tony Edwards, R.I.P., at Freeze Records. I remember I walked into his office and he had Reasonable Doubt, had just come in. And a lot of people don't know this, that Jay and Dane, they couldn't get distribution for Reasonable Doubt when they first put it out. So the original version of that record, which I have 2 of here somewhere, came out on Freeze Records. That was their original distributor, which is a tiny little dance label out of New York, if you're not familiar with it. And that was really kind of like my first kind of entree into understanding the music industry. And, we were just doing like instrumental hip hop joints for like these compilations he was putting together. But, we probably did about 4 or 5 of them. And, a couple we would pull in some kids to rhyme on it. And I was primarily I was unable to program a beat because I didn't own the machine, but I would just bring records in and be like, yo, sample this part right here. And then, he would kind of chop it and arrange shit. And so, I started to kind of get more into that and, fading out of art. And, eventually I got to the point where I started going pretty hard on records. I'm like now working in the World Trade Center, and I'm making pretty decent money.
What were you doing there?
So I wound up, after I kind of left the sign business, I remember moving in. I'm like, yo, this is for the birds. I mean, we're up 3, 4 o'clock in the morning in like a bus depot in New Jersey at like, 20-degree weather, like trying to wrap these buses, and I'm laying on the ground in the garage, and I'm just like, yo, this ain't it, man. No. So I had to get out of this. So I went and just got like a corporate job and like a temp agency. Like, they need somebody to go do some paperwork. I'm like, yo, I don't gonna lay on the ground in a garage at 3 a.m, bro. Say less. So I went over, got this little gig, went in the second day, and I came in with dreads, and I was like on some scroungy art guy, but I'm in this corporate setting, and I'm like, man, this is mad comfortable. So I cut my dreads off the second day, and next thing you know, this guy kind of took me under his wing, who had kind of organized this program that they were bringing temps in for, and he took a liking to me, and he kind of made me like a manager there inside the office. But I was still a tip, but I'm managing like 5 other people that work there. And then he eventually was like, bro, I'm about to leave to go to this company that was in the World Trade Center. It's like, you should come with me. To do what? And he's like, to recruit, because it was like, 98, big IT game, Y2K programmers, all that. So I went with him, and he taught me how to be a technical recruiter. And so I was recruiting guys in IT, working on the 79th floor of the World Trade Center. Did that for a year. He got an offer from a place right a floor below us. And and asked me to come with him. So I did. And that's when I got into like selling software. It was the very beginning of like voice over IP. So I started doing like business development. But at the same time, now I got some money and now I'm going ham on eBay. I'm like buying a shit ton of records. And I live in an apartment, a basement apartment in Brooklyn. So I don't want my shit getting stolen. So I'm having everything shipped to me at the World Trade Center. So, I mean, the mail girl would come and be like, Andre, here, and like pull me like a stack of records and boxes like on my desk. And people are like, what is that? I'm cracking it open like, oh shit, the Buana record. Oh, like, and they're looking at me inside, the World Trade Center like, what is this fucking guy doing? And, at that point, I think that was when I got the idea for Wax Poetics, when I wanted to, I think it was around, oh God, maybe David Axelrod. At that time, it's like the internet is really starting to kind of bubble. And I don't know if you remember The Breaks, but it might even still be around. TheBreaks.com was like a site where
it got closed down a few months ago.
I had to feel it. Oh, really? Wow, that recently.
Oh no! Sorry, I'm getting confused. No, sorry. SoulStrut was wound down.
Oh
recently.
yeah. Oh wow.
But yeah, they were the two, weren't they? With a lot of knowledge.
Yeah. So, and a lot of the SoulStrut guys came out of The Breaks, like the original Breaks. Like you'd have Diplo like writing chats, and I mean, it was like you didn't even know. I just saw Diplo. Nobody knew who any of these people were. We were just like collecting records. But I started to understand like there were people in the UK and in Italy and Germany and Japan. And I'm starting to realize, yeah, this like motherfuckers all over the world are on this shit, but they're like, it was some serious record nerdery. We were just like breaks. Where's breaks? Are there breaks on this record? Are there breaks? It was almost like everything else was beside the point. And that was our focus, was just collecting breaks. And so, I think I kind of like started to ask some questions that were maybe a little too esoteric for those groups. That's what my boy would be like, no, it's such a bunch of record nerds. You can't be like asking questions like this. I'd be like talking about the evolution of black music or this, that, and the other. And these guys are like, what? Come on, we're just trying to correct records here. So I was really getting into it. And again, coming out of like private school and wanting to be an engineer. And, now I've gone to art school and I'm making all these sort of connections between like hip hop and borrowing and sampling and modern art. And, I'm realizing, this is a real art form that people probably should know more about, how this all came about and how it's all connected to these records. And so I really wanted to kind of like, my boy was a documentary, he was a filmmaker, but I was like, hey, would you help me put this documentary together on like record nerds and record collecting and how those records became like the beginning of like hip hop when they started sampling those. And so I started doing research and I started going out to bookstores and magazine stores, library, trying to find information on some of these guys I've been hearing about, David Axelrod. And, I knew the Sly Stones and James Browns, but there were all these new artists that people were talking about, or I had no idea even how to find out more info about them. It's the very beginning of the internet, but there weren't like huge music sites up already with all this info. So I really kind of took it upon myself to say, well, there's a story here. I don't know how it needs to be told, but if there's no information to make a documentary, maybe I should just work on getting the information in case someone in the future wants to make a documentary, then at least they'll have something to go back to. And that was really where the idea for Wax Poetics came from. I really hit my man, and that I had just been cool with. I mean, I had been cool with him at the very end of college. We met, and then he wound up moving to New York for about a year, and we would go out, dig in. And then he left, moved to San Diego. So I would be like out digging on a Saturday or whatever. I'd come home with a bunch of records, and then I would hit him and be like, yo, check this shit. And I'd put this, oh, damn, some break would come on, and then he'd be playing me records, and we'd be going back and forth. And so I was like, yo, dude, I got this idea for like a magazine, I guess, like, about like all the shit we're talking about on the breaks, records. We talk about producers and breaks, and collecting, and it's like, oh yeah, that's cool. Yeah, let's do it. And again, I was in New York, he was in San Diego, and he was like, yo, I work with a guy who is a designer here. He wants to get into doing print because they worked at some internet company, and he's like, I was like, cool. I never even met the dude. I'm like, yeah, cool. Can he like lay out a magazine? Yeah, cool. Straight. So that was it. That was how it started. I just was like, yeah, let's start putting. So, I'm reading about all these. Now it's the beginning of the internet. So people are starting to talk about records, and there's little websites popping up, but it's like, I'm realizing, there's a bunch of knowledge, but it just hasn't been coalesced. But there's like writers out on the internet. So I'd read an article on the internet, and then I'd look and see, back then everybody would put their email address. So I'm like, oh shit. I emailed the guy, yo, I just read your article about, whatever, Tito or Eddie Palmieri or whatever. And yo, I'm like putting this magazine together, and man, I'd love for you to contribute. I don't have any money. Like, we're just really starting this thing out. And, I remember I'm still friends with John Carlucci. I remember when I wrote him, and he wrote back something like, I remember he said something like, I really appreciate your passion. And yeah, let's do something, and I remember kind of that still guides me, because that was really what drove everything, was my passion. And as I emailed people excitedly, it kind of came through about this idea I had. And even though I didn't have any money, it was the passion who kind of be like, yo, I'm down. Like, what do you need? And I always promised that, man, one day when we get money, I'll make sure. And, I was actually able to live up to my word on that. So yeah, it really just started with me reaching out little by little and doing less and less work in the World Trade Center, to the point that on August 4th, 2001, while being employed on the Tower 1 of World Trade, I was on the 78th floor at that point, and they were like, yo, listen, bro. And I mean, I didn't argue with them. I knew I wasn't doing any work. I was literally coming in there, emailing writers all. I'm like trying to put together a magazine on their dime. So they're like, bro, I was like actually relieved, like, good, I can go now work on the magazine. And I had been having conversations with a guy across the street from the World Trade Center. After work, we'd go have drinks, and he was a bartender there. And I told him, yeah, I'm working on this magazine. And he's like, oh, I used to sell ads. Word? Shit. So I go over there after work every day and ask him about advertising and ad sales and how that works and how do you get them and this, that, and the other, and what do you got to do? Media kit? What is all this, like, rates? And I don't know jack shit about a magazine, so I'm learning it all. I remember I bought this, one of those dummies, how to for dummies. It was like how to run a magazine or newsletter, I think was the name of the book. And I bought it, and just little by little I read it and just pieced it together. And I got to the point where we were close but not quite there. And then they laid me off.
Were there many people when you said, yeah, I'm going to do a magazine, were there many people that were like, are you sure you want to do a magazine? Have you thought about doing a website, given the sort of timing of it?
Yeah. No, I know. Yeah. I mean, I think people, this is like 2000. So you got to think back to like the 90s zine era. You know, people, when I'm telling them I want to do a magazine, they're thinking about some stapled version that I do at Xerox. I Xerox at, Staples or something. So, I don't think they had an understanding of what I was talking about when I said magazine, because I had gone around. I was obsessed with magazines. I would buy especially if it's hip hop. So I had everything from The Source to Ego Trip to 4080 and I'm literally going out buying them all, and each of them, maybe Vibe or whatever, would have like one article on something to do with records. It could have been like one artist or one digger article, and I just ripped them all out. The one article that all these magazines had about records, and then I put them all together and was like, this is the magazine I want to make. And so people just figured it was going to be like a zine, and this is so early at 2000, people were like, my guy had built like a GeoCities site about David Axelrod. That's how he and Egon connected, because he was obsessed with David Axelrod and made this like website about it. So yeah, I think it just seemed like the internet, I'm coming out of like going to art school. I'm looking at all these art journals, how they're like printed on really nice paper and how they use footnotes, and people take this shit very seriously. And I'm realizing, some of these hip hop magazines are like printed on porn mag paper, the off register printing. It's, I'm like, man, it's some of this shit. It doesn't look like it. You should take it seriously. So, I just got the idea to like present this stuff that typically is presented as like throwaway culture as like high art, and put it up there in the way that you would talk about, Renaissance architecture or any other kind of high art form. And so that was like the goal. I knew also, though, because I had been reading a shit ton of anything I could find about hip hop, books, magazines, whatever. I did not want, and no shots at Trisha Rose, but there's like an academic kind of like hip hop scholar approach that is like very kind of like ivory tower, highfalutin. Could be black academics writing this stuff, but it kind of takes this other air and it almost becomes inaccessible, especially like in, the mid 90s and stuff where, they weren't even necessarily part of the culture sometimes. They may have been African American, but they were still like very academic and almost like had an issue with some hip hop, especially like the misogynistic parts. And so I knew I wanted to make this a smart magazine, but I didn't want it to be an academic journal. Even though we started calling it a quarterly journal, I was trying to not make it too dry. And as I kind of did a couple issues and started to understand, newsstand and everything, I started to kind of perfect that formula. But yeah, I think really that was primarily how, the whole thing kind of just started with me just thinking, hey, you know what, let's put a magazine together. And the next thing you know, I got laid off from that job on August 4th, 2001. Had still been going back to the World Trade Center to talk with the guy about ads. And then, of course, a month later, the towers fell. And, I was going to be going back to the World Trade Center later that day. So, I'm looking at everything. And for the next 2 weeks after 9/11, I was like in a daze, because I were a bunch of people I knew who worked there that were missing still, or I hadn't heard anything about because, I wasn't there anymore, out of contact, not sure if they made it out that day or didn't. So I was like a zombie. I remember like and I was telling my partners, bro, man, we're about to go into a war. Like, I don't even think anybody's going to want to read a magazine about music, bro. Like, we might just like dead this whole thing. And they were like, oh man, we're real close. So, but, take some time. And, and over the course of 2 weeks, I just realized, damn, I could have been there that day. And, there's a reason why I got laid off a month earlier so I could start this project. or I could finish this project. And you know what? Like at this point, we're so close. Let me just get this first one out, even if it's the only one we ever do. And then we'll figure it out from there. And that was kind of, August 11th, 2000 or September 11th, 2001. 3 months to the day later, we had a launch party on December 11th, 2001 at Ludlow Bar with like Kane and Mao and Language and Monk and a ton of other DJs. Nobody really knew what the hell we were or what we were doing. It was just mostly all the heads there. But yeah, that was it. First one came out. I didn't have any understanding about what to expect, but people were feeling it.
How did you work out how many copies to print up?
Yeah, I mean, really just trying to figure out how much money we could get together and how many copies that would get us. And I think it came to like 5,000 copies, I think, for the first one. And then, yeah, we put them out and it sold out like immediately. Unfortunately, I didn't know how that all worked. Like, I'm like, okay, so where's my money? They're like, oh, wait, no, you got to wait 6 months and then we'll just sell the stuff. And then, what the fuck? So, that's why the second issue of Wax Poetics doesn't come out for about 6 months, because I was like, well, wait, we got to put another issue out. I thought that'd be quarterly here, but we had to wait for the money to come back in from the first issue before we could even go to print, before we got credit and they started to understand, oh, these guys are actually serious and turning this into a real business. So, yeah, that was pretty much how the whole thing started, man.
Did you successfully sell ads into the first copy then?
Yeah, we definitely could have probably printed twice as many, which is why those early issues became, at one point, especially so collectible. But yeah, I remember even calling, I won't name names or businesses, but I remember calling some like major online retailers back then prior to it coming out. And, like, hey, this is Andre Torres, I'm trying to start this magazine. And, they're all like, oh, yeah, well, because they're like the big dogs on the internet selling all the cool stuff. Yeah, well, I mean, like they didn't have time to talk to me. And there was one guy who ran the thing, again, not to name names, and he was like very short and like, but again, I'm coming out of a corporate environment where as a recruiter, I'm making 300 cold calls a day. So I'm living on the phone. That's why I was utilizing that skill set to recruit writers, because I'm now writing letters like I'm recruiting an IT guy. I'm just now doing it to writers all about hip hop and breaks and shit. So, I think that was kind of the thing that like threw it all off, because yeah, suddenly, I was somewhat self-sufficient and being able to kind of just put it all together. I just didn't understand like the logistics of it and the business side. One guy who became a really important part in that was Raymond Roker, who started Herb magazine, because it was one of the only other magazines like music kind of indie that I knew of. And somebody mentioned, you got to talk to Raymond. And I didn't know the guy, but they connected us. And I just remember like, bro, how do you do this? And he was like, oh, you got to talk to Ralph Davila. I'll never forget the guy's name. And I was like, who's that? He goes, he's at Indie Press or whatever. And it was like one of the major indie distributors. That was the guy who would get you into Barnes and Noble. And that was it. Once we got linked up with him, then I started to really understand how the newsstand works and how distribution works. And that's really when the growth period began. And yeah, that was a long time ago now. But yeah, it was quite an adventure.
Were people picking up advertising then in the first one? Sorry.
The first one had like three ads, and I don't think any of them were paid for. I think they were all trades. I know one was Turntable Lab. Wow, I'm not even sure on the other. Maybe Mixwell or something like that, one of those brands. But yeah, I think there were like three. And, I wasn't really equipped to sell. I was playing publisher, editor-in-chief, copy editor, photo editor. So I didn't even really have any understanding about that side of the business yet. So it wasn't until around the fourth issue that I got a call from a guy who was like, "Hey man, how's it going?" I'm like, "Cool." He's like, "Oh, I'm in the new issue in an ad. Like that's like my boy and I's company, and one of the T-shirts that was in it from a company called Digital Gravel by
Yeah.
a guy who ran this company called NEMA. NEMA is actually a pretty famous artist now, so big shouts to NEMA. He used to run Digital Gravel, and yeah, he had made a T-shirt with his boy that was in the Digital Gravel ad. So he hits me up. He's like, and he tells me, "Yo, I sell ads for DJ Magazine." I'm like, what, bro? And so he starts calling me. What a hell of a sales guy. I tell him still to this day. He never asked me for a job or anything. He would just call me and talk to me and about the magazine, what we're working on. And I pick his brain about ad sales. And eventually he started doing like some consulting, like, "Here, let me try to sell ads for you." And, I'm like, "Here, you keep X percentage of it and, give us the rest." And that worked so well. At one point, he was like making more money than I was comfortable to give him from a percentage standpoint, because I was like, "Well, damn, like we need to keep this in house. Like, why don't you come work for us?" And so that was pretty much how Dennis Coxon came on and became our ad guy, which is really where the growth period, bringing in Adidas and all the, music instrument makers and all the little indie record labels and retail spots and internet retailers. Like he went deep, and that's when we really started to establish like a advertising identity. But yeah, that was, I knew absolutely nothing about it. And, that was probably the most difficult learning curve in understanding how to make a magazine cool, fun, and still profitable. And
Yeah.
it's, especially at that era, was definitely starting to become more challenging than it had been in years past.
Once a DJ is brought to you with the support of Vinyl Underground Record Store. Since 1993, VU has been shipping new and used underground house, techno, disco, hip-hop, soul and more worldwide from Northampton in the UK. They're your go-to store for upfront releases, repressed classics and deep digging for undiscovered gems. And they're a great crew to deal with who really care about the music and their customers. To show the support to the Once a DJ community, they're giving you 10% off your next order. Just head to vinylunderground.co.uk and use the code ONCEADJ10 at checkout. You also get free UK delivery on all orders over £100. That's ONCEADJ10 at vinylunderground.co.uk. I wanted to create a product for the listeners to be able to support the show and for the guests as a token of gratitude for being on, so I've teamed up with Sure Shot Shop to create some Once a DJ 45 RPM adapter clamps. These are my weapon of choice as a 45 adapter, as they add stability and grip to aid you in any setup. These are available for £25 each plus flat fee postage from onceadj.bigcartel.com, and if you'd like to see the other models you can buy and also customise, check out sureshotshop.com. Was it easy from the start? Because, this is really interesting stuff to me, because there's so many parallels with certain things that I'm trying to do. And there's things sometimes I think, like I always tend to work alone. I'm not very good at collaborating. I can try and psychoanalyze why. Could be one of many reasons. But like, I think something that can be hard sometimes is when people have just very, very subtly different values that might affect big decisions for how something goes. Is that something that was ever a challenge during this growth period? And if so, how did you manage it?
Yeah, I think you make a great point. And then you coming out of, being a fine artist who sits in a studio painting all day, I definitely feel that very solo, independent mind that, again, most of the time I was not working with groups of people, but much more solitarily. So this was more challenging than I probably thought it would be initially. I don't think I gave it too much thought at first. And, but as it evolved and we get to a point where, we're getting an office and, now we have like employees and interns and, I was sort of like fumbling my way through understanding how to be, CEO, how to be a leader, how to properly, run a company. That was a huge learning curve. But I think, I started to understand I can't do everything and I need people who are really good at the stuff I'm not. And so, that was why I called Brian DeGenti, the homie who became my co-founder and editor, because I had worked with him briefly when I wrote an article for a magazine in college, and he was kind of working with the editor. And so that was kind of how we first met. So I knew I couldn't. I mean, I loved reading articles, but I was no English major, no journalism major. I didn't know like how things needed to be copy edited and all that. So bringing him in, I knew that I had a level of quality from an editorial standpoint I wanted. And so I knew he could deliver that. And so, yeah, it was a similar situation with Dennis where it was like, listen, I can't sell these ads. I'm definitely more of like a creative person than a sales guy, but because they're a different animal. Because once he came in and I saw, it's just like bulldog, like these guys, sales guys are just like, go get the money. And so I'm like, yeah, here you go, And so that was pretty much how I learned how to lean and trust other people and work more collaboratively. I was diagnosed with OCD last year. So, I look back at my life in certain periods in the way that I handled things and my like attention or over attention to detail. And that is definitely my OCD coming through. I didn't understand it back then. Now I have a term for it and I can recognize when I'm in it and when it's happening. But back then I just thought I was, giving things the right amount of attention and thought and not overthinking and giving over attention. But, there's something to be said for that, because that definitely, especially as you're working with people that you're learning about, how they work and how you work and how you work together, that's a process that, takes time to kind of settle in. And so, I think I may have at times certainly been unprepared for how to navigate that and, popped off on people or got angry or was just running around like a chicken with my head cut off and couldn't give people the proper attention as like a manager and leader. So, you kind of fumble your way through a lot of that. But with that comes like the understanding that, all of these people are very important to the process. And without them, it probably wouldn't exist. So I have become much more comfortable over the years working in teams and, again, having like a team of my own who I can kind of say, hey, I need you to go do this. I need you to go do that. And then, it all kind of work and stay cool and still keep it breezy and not get too stressed out and not pop off on people. That I realize is the real skill of management and leadership that even guys I've worked with who've been in the record industry for 50 years damn near still are incapable of doing properly, because they grew up in an era when you didn't have to care about how other people felt. You just came out of your office, start screaming and yelling, pound on your desk, and everybody goes, but you try that shit in a startup with 20-something-year-old kids to see how that works. They'll look at you like, who the fuck is this guy? Like, nobody's really scared anymore by somebody pounding on their desk. So yeah, the game changes and you got to figure out new ways and strategies. So yeah.
So something else that I wanted to ask about is kind of reaching out to artists, say like a Madlib, for example. Would there have been a lot of
Really?
artists like that that when you started the magazine, they were quite easy to get in contact with, but then as the profile grew, would it maybe get harder or like, I mean, your kind of Rolodex must have gotten pretty full with some amazing contacts over the years, I guess, from doing the magazine.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not like I would pick up the phone and call Madlib, like, yo, what's up, bro? But, having Egon be right there at Stone's Throw, and again, he was big fan in the magazine, had been cool with Brian on the kind of like, I mean, that David Axelrod cover, well, it was a two-parter because he was on the cover of 14, and then the second half of the article was in 15. That was him and Egon that wrote that. So, when we wanted to get to Madlib, we knew, well, Egon's right there at Stone's Throw, so hit him up and see. And again, he can now go and advocate for it and say, oh, these guys are legit and, they're not going to waste your time. So, yeah, that's how we got Madlib in like the very first issue. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, years later, he winds up on the cover, you know, of like issue 50 something two, maybe. I can't remember exactly now. But, and yeah, in that time, I watched Madlib go from the little producer guy on Stone's Throw who, was all in the loot pack and, put out some of his own records to becoming, a huge major force in, I wouldn't even pigeonhole it to hip hop because, I think the way that Madlib has sort of like subtly affected many parts of music is probably not easy to kind of like overstate. So, that was actually the interview that I did myself when we wound up interviewing Madlib the second time because, I didn't interview too many people willingly. I never thought of myself as a great writer or, interviewer, even for that matter. I knew so many great writers that worked for us that I would always say, here, you do it. Like, I don't. The couple of times I did, it was really kind of like out of necessity, Eugene McDaniels, or I had really something I wanted to talk to that person about. So when it came to Madlib and it was like, well, who's going to do it? I was like, hey, you know what? Yeah, fuck it. I'll do this one. So yeah, getting a chance to just sit with him and talk about music and, black music specifically and, watching his journey from that point, to becoming like a guy who's, sending beats to Kendrick and Dr. Dre. It's like, damn, this is a hell of an arc this guy has had. So I think in seeing that, you start to kind of see us too. You see your evolution in someone else who has been there with you kind of at the bottom from the beginning, and you kind of are starting to see how all of this stuff we were talking. That's why it's so funny. I get into the major labels and everything we've been talking about for 20 years is suddenly now they want to start talking about. I'm like, bro, where were you? I would call these labels when we were doing the magazine and they'd be like, I remember we called EMI. We're like, hey, we got this. Brian, my partner, had done this like HB Barnum. I mean, God, not, yeah. Not, it was HB and not Barnum, but, and Axelrod, his producer. And we call EMI and we're like, yeah, we want to do this David Axelrod compilation. And the woman goes, are you sure he's one of our artists? Now, remember, it was David Axelrod who created the black music department at Capitol Records.
Right.
So for her to say, you sure he's on our label? It's like, yeah, he's pretty much a big part of the history of your label. But clearly you don't know that. And of course, there's nobody there who has any context because you're some lady who works in a legal department. And so you start to understand they just don't give a shit, didn't give a shit until now. It's like you can't ignore it. Record sales are through the roof. And now I get to Universal and suddenly, I can like put out 3 David Axelrod records because now, everybody knows about David Axelrod, and you realize there's actually like music on here that people value. And
yeah, so how did that move happen, and when was it?
So yeah, I did Wax Poetics all the way through, things falling apart essentially in the media industry. Magazines were closing left and right, and we had, in the financial crisis, we had kind of navigated our way through that because at this point now we've built a magazine, a Japanese version. We're publishing books. We're now like consulting for Codigo, who had just bought the Fania catalog, and so we're helping them like rebrand and relaunch the label. So we were pretty good through the sort of worst of the crisis. It didn't really come until after that when they started to kind of like settle in around 2010, 11, where it started to really hit. And I was like, oh shit, like, the project with Fania was done and things are drying up. The newsstand, internet is definitely like coming. And, you talk about partners and working with other people. I had, come to my partners with like, I think like we might want to go hard on this like internet thing. And, they fought me like, oh man, we don't do internet stuff. We're a print magazine and this, that, and the other. And I said, yeah, but if you look at where this is going, everything's turning into digital. So we're going to have to address it at some point. But, there really wasn't much of a desire. And, again, when you're not a dictator, you can't just say, I don't give a shit. We're going to do it anyway. So, I kind of played the back seat on that. And, as time went and it became more and more important, at some point you try to play catch up. It's like a little too late. So, later they came to me and said, oh, Andre, I think you were right. We probably should have, but by then it was too late. So, there's not really much you can do about that. But, I don't think we were even equipped well enough to be able to handle what you would need in order to scale a website like we were hoping to do. And then, we're in a pretty good niche. It's not like we were talking about like the biggest commercial music that was coming out at the time. So, by 2015, I'm like, okay, I need to go. I got a wife, 3 kids. The magazine is sort of just like on fumes at this point. We've shut the office down. I'm living back home, running it. And I was just like, I gotta make a move here, bro. I can't continue like this. So I just went to my 2 partners and said, listen, I'm going to have to go and find another job. And I did as a copywriter for Black Enterprise Magazine, thinking, okay, I'm going to do Wax Poetics. I'm just going to do a little part-time job. Worst job I ever had. I was there 45 days and then they came to me and said, we don't think this is working out. I was like, I would have to agree with you. This is the worst fucking job I've ever had. And they didn't like me because I had run my own magazine now for over a decade. So I'm looking at what they're doing. And, I became cool with like the creative director, but I was only hired as a copywriter. So I had some woman who was but again, I've been an editor-in-chief for a decade. So I'm copywriting, but I'm like doing this shit in my sleep. So as I finish, I'm walking around and I'm, the guy who was the creative director had gone to my college. We weren't friends, but we were alumni together, so we got cool, would talk. And so he'd be working on the new issue and he'd put the cover up on the wall and I'd come over and we'd be chatting about it. And then my boss would see me talking with the head creative director about the direction of well, that's not your job. And you're supposed to copy or edit. And, I would copy edit circles around her, but again, I'm like, okay, cool. I'm going to play the role of the little copy editor guy. I won't get too much in the mix. But she could not handle it. It was just like she had been there for like 10 years and this was her copy editing job and she was going to keep all her copy editors. And I'm like, I'm not the one. So they were like, hey, and that's when I was like, you know what? Maybe I can't do this like 1 foot in, 1 foot out thing where I'm like working on the magazine and trying to get a part-time job. Like I just need to go get a job. And so that's when I really started looking at like the intersection of music and tech. Because again, all of this was caused by tech, the internet, all this. I'm like, well, shit, I need to get in on that. So that's when I started looking. My boy was at Apple. I had a couple of interviews with them on the editorial side. I had an intern who was at, well, former intern slash writer who was now at Instagram. I hit him up, I'm like, bro, I saw your Instagram. He got me in a couple of interviews with a role he was in on the music side. You know, got a couple of interviews in, didn't work. Bandcamp, my man Andrew Jervis had just sort of taken. They were looking for like an editor in chief. It was just as they were starting to do content over there. I don't. Yeah, it didn't work out. You know, we had a couple conversations, and then I wound up at Genius, which, you know, formerly Rap Genius. They were just bringing in all of like the editorial guys. So like one of the guys who had written for me at Scratch magazine, which I didn't mention, I kind of launched while I was doing Wax Poetics for Harris Publications. Rob had written for me a couple of times there, so now he's there, JFK, and, you know, eventually all these people from Complex, Brendan Frederick, Laura Nostro. And so, yeah, I was chilling at Genius. I was like, this is perfect, because like I was running the kind of like behind the lyrics pop-up video thing that they were kind of doing on Spotify, and I ran a team of editors, and you know, I was still able to do storytelling around music, which is what I realized my real love and passion is. But it was a new form, you know, and it was a new group of kids. Like, you know, I'm dealing with a bunch of old men, God bless our souls, at Wax Poetics. I'm in here at Genius. These kids are coming right out of college. Like, so I'm looking at how they're consuming music and what they're listening to and how they're listening to it. And I'm, you know, seeing some of these kids buying records, but they're not even opening the record. They're putting the record up on their desk and it's still sealed and it's like merch. Like, it's, wow, this is interesting. They're streaming everything. And so that was 2016. And I thought I was going to stay there forever, really. I mean, I was like, oh, this place is great. I was like close by. I'd ride my bike to work. My kid's school was close. My wife's was a private chef for a private school. And so her job was maybe 10 minutes away. It was just ideal. And then I got a call from Universal. And it was really Elvis Mitchell who had been on his show. And we kind of, you know, stayed cool. He'd come in New York and we'd have cigars, a couple drinks. And so he called me. It's like his now wife was working at Universal, still is, I believe, and said, yeah, they got a role. You think maybe Andre would be interested in it? So he hit me up and it turned out to be this like vice president of urban catalog at Universal, which basically, you know, I didn't even really know what all this catalog stuff meant, but essentially was just like old music. So I'm like, oh, okay, that's right up my alley. And it was urban, so it was everything from like hip hop to James Brown. I'm like, oh shit, let's go. So went in, had a couple combos, and then eventually, they brought me in, and I moved out to LA. That's really how my LA journey started. In the end of 2016, top of 2017, I started like literally January 3rd, but we moved out here a couple weeks prior. So that was really my entree into the actual music industry, which, you know, to be honest, I never thought I would ever be a part of. I just was the media guy at an indie magazine, and I didn't really know what the hell they really did at these labels, because for me, they just seemed useless most of the time. I was like, y'all don't know what records to put out. Y'all don't have the photos I need. It's like, what good are you?
So what was it like going from, say, like the run in a magazine, if we kind of ignore the sort of bits in between, to then going into like a huge corporation like Universal?
Oh, God. It's painful. Painful is all I can say. I mean, it's one thing to come into these buildings with, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and ready to kind of like go get it, do something incredible. Because, when I got the offer, I was like, oh man, do I want to go work for a record label, big record label? And again, we had been looking to get out of New York. And so this was an opportunity to move to LA. And again, more money than I had ever been offered in my life. So it was like, okay, but once you get in there, you start to understand a lot of the preconceptions that you had or what you had heard about were actually true. There were a lot of people there who didn't give a shit. There were a lot of decisions that were made purely by lawyers and business affairs people. Now, I had spoken to someone yesterday, and she asked about a dirty little secret in the industry, and mine was that there are people, because she was like, sometimes dirty little secret is good. My dirty little secret that was good is that there are some people inside these buildings who are still passionate about music. The sad part is most of the time their voices get drowned out, or they've worked there long enough that they've been beaten down and hardened to a point where they don't care anymore. So I think the real challenge in those spaces is, I'm realized I'm an entrepreneur at heart. So I think it was hard for me to, and still is to a degree, I've had to kind of switch my brain a little bit in order to kind of make it work in those spaces, because you can't really think too entrepreneurial in these corporate spaces. Most of the people have only worked in these corporate spaces their whole lives, so they're not entrepreneurial thinkers. I think I just was always, especially even coming out of making art, I would just find shit and turn it into art. So I'd take paintings out of the garbage can and buy paint from the goddamn paint store that like they mixed up the wrong color for somebody, sell it for $2 a can. Give me that, I'll take it, And so I'm used to, flipping it, take something and turn it into something. That's not how those people think there. They are safe and they don't want to rock the boat, and they want to, I think, take the easy, comfortable way. If they come against challenges, most of them throw their arms up and say, well, we can't do it. I'm like, oh, we're going to get this done and we're going to fucking figure out how. That's how my brain works. Theirs is like, oh, it can't work, shut it down. And because they've got 90 other things on their desk they have to deal with, I don't want to have to worry about this. It's too much trouble. If I got to use my brain to think to everything needs to be easy and just automated. So the minute you come in there like, hey, I got this idea about Roy Ayers, they're like, I mean, of course, especially if it's Roy Ayers, like, if I had come in and said, I got this idea about Kanye West, and they look at the revenue that's coming out of Kanye West, they're like, okay, what do you got to say? Because all they care about is what makes money. And, at this point, Roy Ayers is not at the top of that list for them. And so that's when you start to understand it doesn't matter about cultural relevance or any of that. When it comes to these labels, it's a business, and that's the hard part, I think, for people to swallow, especially now that they're mostly owned by, they're public companies, so there are shareholders they have to answer to, and everything is about quarterly growth. And so by any means necessary, I think, is the way they see it. And so I would say 90% of the music just sits there. There's no one touching it. There's no one going to touch it because it just does what it does. And then the other 10% that drives all the revenue, they'll spend all their time on the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Fleetwood Mac, whatever it is.
That must be so frustrating when you're someone who knows what an incredible archive there is there.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, you're 100% correct. You know, and I tried to dig in and show them opportunities in that, but it's hard, you know, trying to teach a large company like that how culture works down here. Their idea is that culture dribbles down from them. We sign the artist, we put the press release out, we put them on the Jimmy Fallon show, and now everybody has to come and look up here. And I'm like, no, that's not how it works. Real artists start down here, they get a following, they bubble up, and then the fans, and now the internet has sort of like solidified this. The fans respond, and then eventually y'all come into the picture when you think it's going to be big enough. Like, you're not down here finding out what works in culture and what doesn't and understanding all of that. Even your A&Rs at this point are just looking at SoundCloud numbers, and it's all algorithm streams, like, you know, it's all number quantified. Most of these guys don't have any capacity for culture. I was in conversations at record labels where I was like shocked to hear people running major labels saying, we're not in the culture business. That's not what we do. And I'm like, what? You try to tell that to your artists. These guys are out here busting their ass trying to come up with something that speaks to the culture, that speaks to our moment and time here as people on this planet, or you in this certain neighborhood on this planet at this point. And you're going to tell them, sorry, we're not in the business of culture? I mean, I think all of your artists would tell you, great, then I'm going to go get a deal somewhere where they do prioritize that. But this is the way that these people, and I'm talking people who've been there running labels for 20, 30 years, and I was shocked to think like, damn, y'all don't understand the connection that you have, that these artists are driving culture with these songs. Like, you don't understand your role in this. So that's when you start to realize, like, their priorities are completely different. They're just completely beholden to shareholders at this point. And it's just like, just make sure that we hit our number. And that becomes the mantra every year. And it's like, by any means necessary, you know, put out 10 box sets or whatever it is you need to do in order to hit that number, and we're good. And no one's going to say anything, and you keep on keeping on. It's when I go in there and go, yo, I want to put a Marvel project together, or I wanted to, and then the lawyers have to like, we've never done anything like this, and then they have to work and do things they've never done before, and then, you know, you're just trying things. Not everything is you're not going to knock it all out of the park. You're trying to experiment and show them, but they don't want experiments. They just want you to come in and do the same thing that the last guy did, because we know that works. So, you know, you quickly realize, I guess it's not even worth trying this. You know, you come up with an idea, and then you start to realize, oh, this is how that guy wound up like this, because he probably was excited at one point too, but now when you go to him and say, yo, I got this idea, that he goes, well, that's because 10 years ago, he was me. He was excited too. And then now he's burned the fuck out, and now he just comes in and clocks in and out and just does the work and goes home and whatever. And, you know, that was not why I got into this industry.
How long did you last then? Because you've left now, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I got laid off in October. So I was probably, you know, I went 3.5 years at Universal, a little over a year at Spotify, and then back to the labels at Warner for another 2 years. So, you know, about 7 years. And, you know, I can't say I will never go back. I mean, I don't think there's any getting out of this industry kind of once you're in it, unless you completely divorce yourself and go into a completely different career. But I love music. I'm not going to let these corporations chase me out of something I'm passionate about. But whether or not I would work for another major label or for a like large tech company that deals with music, that's probably highly unlikely. I'm not necessarily looking to start my own venture either. I've been like down that road, but somewhere in the middle is probably where I'll wind up. Somewhere where I'm allowed a little bit more creative freedom and I could take some risks more than I can at the label. But again, I'm not looking to, you know, struggle paying my rent as I may have, 20 years ago when I was starting my own venture. So somewhere in the middle there where I can be creative, but excuse me, there's still some structure, some stability. And so, yeah, I'm kind of consulting and dipping my toe and hands in a couple different cookie jars at this point.
Have you had anything to do with the reboot of Wax Poetics then?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, we still do own parts of that company. We kind of did like a license deal with the guys. And yeah, we have quarterly meetings with them. They're in a little bit of a relaunch phase right now too. And so I'm not sure how much of that has been revealed publicly, but probably be hearing more about that soon. And we probably reconnected maybe a month ago to talk more about like what that looks like and how I'll probably be coming back on to get a little bit even more involved than I have been in the past. So yeah, I'm still riding for those guys. I still love the brand. They send me copies and I still read it. So, yeah, it's still my baby. And I'm going to keep riding as long as I said before, till the wheels fall off. So yeah, we got some things we're cooking up with them. And yeah, should be some announcements coming soon.
Can't wait to hear about that. This has been such an enjoyable conversation.
Right on, man. I appreciate it. It's been good to reminisce and go back down memory lane. So thanks for the opportunity.
Amazing. Where can people find you on socials?
Got Beats, one of the first Instagram accounts, I guess, because every time I tell people, like, how the hell did you get that name? So Got Beats at Instagram, Got Beats on Twitter. I'm not the most active, but occasionally I pop up, and I've been making a lot of art recently, so I've been throwing a couple of those things on there. So yeah, I got some news coming probably in the next few months too, so I'll keep you updated on that as well.
Brilliant. And one more question. Were you never tempted? Because I know I sort of said to you before, were you ever sort of heavy into DJing? And you said it was just odd bits and bobs. Was it never for you, the DJing side of it?
I love the sort of like process of like picking out records and going in and playing records for people and seeing their reaction. And, like I said, I think I used to do like house parties. My guy had like a big loft in Williamsburg in like the mid 90s. So he would throw these big parties and I would just bring records and DJ. I didn't realize, at the time, these parties were actually becoming like pretty big. There were like hundreds of people and it was a big loft, and I would play weird shit like, Serge Gainsbourg and all these art kids in Williamsburg would, oh my God, they'd lose their mind and shit. So I realized, okay, I was probably a little bit ahead of the curve when it came to kind of like what that evolved into, where those all became like proper bars and clubs, and people started getting like regular gigs to play weird stuff like that in Williamsburg and Brooklyn. So I never considered myself to be like a great DJ. I might be able to pull some records and put on, but I don't have any technical skills. I don't really know how to like beat match or, so when I look at some guys I do know, who consider themselves DJs and I look at what they can do and their skill set, I'm like, I would never call myself a DJ. When I'm around guys like that, hell no. Same with writing, I think, as I mentioned earlier. It's like I could put together an article, but I know some dudes who can turn a phrase and just write such beautifully constructed sentences and paragraphs that I'm like, I would never consider myself a writer. So, or a journalist in that respect. So, the DJ thing, I got my turntables over here. I get down a little in the crib and put some records on. The family loves my selection for the most part. But, outside of the house, you'd be hard pressed to find me spinning records in public, especially nowadays, man. These kids they got all kinds of technology. I'm old school with it. Just put a record on and let it ride. So, yeah.
Great. Right. Thanks ever so much for your time today, Andre.
Certainly, man.
And hopefully speak to you soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you, Adam. We'll talk soon, man.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Once a DJ. If you'd like to support the show, then head to onceadj.com/support to find out how you can help. If you'd like to get in touch with any feedback or suggestions, email onceadjpodcast@gmail.com. Once a DJ is produced by the good people at Remote Control. If you'd like to find out more about working with them, head to remote-ctrl.co.uk.
That was nice.